My parents were going to take me to juvenile home, so I ran away.
Wendy Mazares is attracted to more than just the glitz of Las Vegas.
I went in the Horseshoe Club because Teddy Binion was a nice-looking guy.
But fate deals her a bad hand.
The owner of the brothel took me and put me in this room. I didn't know where I was.
Teddy told them she would be like breaking in a new horse.
I was used horribly.
Now she must play her cards right.
He kissed me, and then it just went from there.
Before a mobster cashes in on her life.
They said he's one of the most prolific killers of all time.
What kind of psychotic person has his wife write a suicide note?
He pulled out the gun, and he had it at the back of my head. And he said, "Start digging." I've lived the life of a 200-year-old woman. I'm surprised I'm still alive. I probably could say I had a daddy wound because my father was absent all the time. But I was always looking for that male figure to protect me.
It's 1968, and Wendy Mazares is 13 years old, running wild in rural Nevada.
Las Vegas was a great place to grow up during the 60s and 70s.
Vegas was sort of a Hollywood playground. The Rat Pack was here, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Marilyn Monroe. But meanwhile, it was a small town with small town friendliness.
My parents did the best they could with what they had. My mother was gone from 5:30 in the morning until 6 o'clock at night. She had top security clearance to Area 51.
Area 51 is a U.S. Air Force military installation in southern Nevada and the birthplace of the nuclear bomb.
My mother always kept a tight lip on what she did, and she would always make sure and call home to tell us when a bomb was going to go off because the entire house would rattle. My father was a truck driver. He was an absent father because he was on the road so much. We probably saw him once a week, if that.
When they do see their dad, he is often drunk and abusive to Wendy and her siblings.
Dad, I think probably due to his drinking, picked on one particular kid and her brother, Michael.
One time, Michael snuck me out of the window, and we went out for a little bit, came back, and my father started calling me horrible names. He called me a whore. At one point, he had my brother up in the corner. He had his hands around his neck, and he was choking him. And my mother had just walked in the house, and she'd taken off her shoe, and she started hitting my father with the heel on his head to make him get off Michael.
Wendy dreams of escaping the abusive household and turns to the glamour of downtown Las Vegas.
I was about 14 when we started taking the bus down to Fremont Street.
Fremont Street was where the Horseshoe was, the Pioneer Saloon, and there was a Woolworth store at one of the corners where she and her friends would hang out.
One day, we took a trip into Las Vegas. We went in the Horseshoe Club because Teddy Binion was a nice-looking guy. And he walked up to us and offered us some ice cream.
He immediately had his arm around her waist. He obviously focused on her because she's very beautiful. She loved that attention and this sort of sense of respect that she felt she hadn't gotten anywhere before.
Teddy is the 26-year-old son of Benny Binion, the owner of the Horseshoe Casino.
Benny Binion was maybe the most famous at that time casino owner in all of Las Vegas. The Horseshoe was renowned for basically no-limit betting, and he took all bets.
I was hanging out with Teddy till late in the evening, and eventually it led into a romantic time.
Wendy is 15 at this point, but she looks much older, and soon her relationship with Teddy turns sexual.
Thought I was an adult, and I thought I could do it on my own. And I would go home, and my parents would be very upset because it was way past curfew, and my parents had enough, and they were going to take me to juvenile home. I ran, and I called Teddy. Teddy hid me up in the casino. He started buying me nice clothes, jewelry, sent me to the beauty salon, and he started sitting me with gamblers, high rollers that would fly in. I would sit at the $1 million poker tournaments. It definitely made me feel that I was finally wanted.
Wendy becomes known as Teddy's girl and is on top of the world until Wendy's mother finds out and reports it to the police.
A detective started coming into the Horseshoe Club asking about me and if anyone had seen me. Teddy told me the heat's getting too hot. We're gonna have to move you to keep you safe. And so he introduced me to this good friend of theirs out of Texas. And he said, go with him for a couple weeks until the heat dies down. Before I left, Teddy says, oh, you'll love Texas. You'll ride some of his horses, drink some lemonade, and just kick back in the sun and enjoy yourself. And it wasn't at all what I expected.
Teddy's friend takes her to a seedy Texas motel.
Well, he said, now you need to work.
You told her, Teddy told me, you'd be like breaking in a new horse.
I didn't know what he was talking about until they took me back into a room with about 3 other girls. And they were trying to calm me down. I was crying. I didn't know where I was. It was very, very scary.
Wendy realizes she's been forced into the sex trade.
Well, the girls started telling me that when the phone rings, we take turns. And I went to the room. A man started telling me what to do and what he wanted, and I didn't really understand everything. I was used horribly.
Wendy is forced to have sex with oil riggers and cowboys for 3 weeks.
My feeling at the time was, I need to get myself through this so I can live. There was one gal there that really cared about me. She showed me a little window in the bathroom. It was just a little tiny one, but I was so skinny then anyway. And so she helped me escape. And when I got to the highway and the cowboy with the white hat in the pickup truck pulled over, I felt relieved. I felt I'm in good hands now.
A few days later, Wendy arrives back in Vegas shattered, homeless, and broke.
It felt good that I was back in Las Vegas, but I couldn't go home in fear I was going to be placed in juvenile home. So I called Teddy, and then Teddy took me back to the club. I truly believe Teddy never knew that was going to happen.
Wendy is a problem for Teddy. She's still underage, and her mother might call the police again if he continues their relationship. But he has a solution.
Teddy said, I'm going to get you a job with another good friend of ours here in Vegas, and we're going to make sure that nothing like this happens to you again.
Teddy makes a few phone calls and then takes Wendy to a restaurant to meet one of his business associates.
Teddy said, that's him right there. Go up and introduce yourself. Tom had his very own booth. All the waitresses knew who he was. I said, Mr. Hanley? He said, yep, what's left of him? He was distinguished, and he had this great smile that made me feel warm. I looked into his eyes. They were stark blue, like they just jabbed right through you, and it gave me chills down my spine. He was a nice older gentleman.
Tom is the owner of an air conditioning company and also does work for the culinary union that represents Las Vegas workers.
We sat down and talked a little bit. People in the restaurant treated him with utmost respect, and that impressed me. He started telling me he needed a receptionist to just answer the phone, no pressure, no nothing. So I said, I can do that, that's great. Could have been a little job, but it still made me feel good about myself. Teddy did ask him, now she's gonna be in good hands, right, Tom? Tom said, of course she will.
And that began her relationship with one of the most notorious hitmen in Las Vegas history.
Wendy Mazzares is thankful for her new job with businessman Tom Hanley, who has taken her under his protective wing.
The following day, I rode with him in the truck. He took me to the business, and there was no one there. It was just Tom and I. And I sat there and waited, but the phone never rang. And it was a pretty boring job, but I was still happy to have it.
Tom seems pleased to have company. Only 3 months earlier, he lost his wife of 40 years to a suspicious overdose of sleeping pills. His 36-year-old son, Granby, lives nearby and works with Tom, who lives alone.
Tom's house was an older home, but it was a nice home.
The job comes with room and board, so Wendy moves in with her new boss.
He made me feel comfortable. I thought he was a gentleman. I felt good inside. I felt good inside about the whole situation. I felt like Tom was definitely giving me a chance to straighten out my life.
Wendy settles into a routine, far from the abuse she suffered at her parents' and in the Texas brothel. But before long, she learns the true nature of Tom's work and why the phone never rings. His air conditioning company is a cover for something far less cool.
One day, Tom took me to a restaurant on Maryland Parkway, which everyone in Vegas knew the gangsters hung out. And when we left, I said, what are you doing in a restaurant like that? He says, I work for the mob. I was floored. I really didn't know what to say because one minute he has the air conditioning business and the next minute he's working for the mob.
Tom Hanley's connection to the culinary union and to mobsters made him a powerful force in Las Vegas. A feared force, actually, more than respected.
And suddenly it started making sense why Tony Spilotro would show up at our home.
Tony Spilotro, people will know basically as Joe Pesci from the movie Casino.
Go get my money or I'll put your brain to sleep.
He was considered like an enforcer. People feared him for that.
Tom's son Granby works with Tony Spilotro in the infamous hole-in-the-wall gang, burglarizing jewelry stores.
Granby was a heroin addict. He was just very unpredictable and scary. One time, Tony Spilotro and his brother came out to the office. They wanted something from Tom. And Tom said, you want something? Here's something, you little. And he started shooting at Tony and his brother's feet and telling them to dance. And then they turned around and ran to their car, screaming at Tom, you crazy old man, you crazy old man.
Wendy realizes that even violent mobsters are fearful of Tom. And while she is under his protection, no one will ever mess with her again.
Tom made me feel very stable. He had a knack for that. He gave me lots of pretty jewelry. One day he asked if he could kiss me, and then it just went from there. Finally, I just gave in to Tom because he did make me feel secure. He was taking care of me, and he was looking out for my best interest.
Tom is 58 and Wendy is 19 when he asks her to marry him in 1976.
He said, you know, we really need to get married and get married Western style. And I said, okay, that sounds great. When Tom proposed to me, I felt a little bit more secure. I know how sick that sounds, but I felt more secure because I figured if I was his wife, then he wouldn't hurt me.
You know, you've heard of sort of the Oedipus complex. He was the father she never had, and she was this incredibly beautiful young woman to him.
We went and got a marriage license down in Las Vegas. We went to a ranch in Colorado.
Wendy is not on great terms with her family, and none of them are invited to the wedding.
He had some clergymen come in, and I was dressed in a red square dancing outfit, and he was dressed in his Western attire. We said our vows, and we were married. It was nice. After we got back from being married, Tom scooped up all the beautiful gowns I had, and he burned them. An overwhelming feeling came over me that, wow, maybe he does care, maybe he's doing it for a reason. Maybe that life that I was living prior, I'll never go back to.
But this was not done with good intentions. In fact, this is the first sign that Tom will not be Wendy's protector, but her new controller.
I had left to go up to meet an old friend, and he had followed me. When I got back, I walked through the front door, and he was there with his fist clenched, and he was shaking, screaming, "Where have you been? I'm gonna knock your head off if you don't tell me the truth." That was one of the first times that I saw Tom in such a fit of rage. I felt, this guy's really gonna kill me. He's really going to kill me. It just terrified me.
She couldn't really have friends because he didn't want her talking to anybody about anything that happened.
After that, he never let me out of his sight. I was always with him, or I was with someone he knew.
Tension escalates one day when Wendy notices some jewelry Tom has given her is missing. Tom's son Granby, the jewel thief, is her first suspect.
I stormed out of the house, walked over to Granby's, knocked on the door. I said, "Where's my jewelry? I know you took it." He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." And I said, "I'm gonna call the cops." And that was the worst thing I could have said. He was going to kill me right then and there. And he jumped on top of me, and he was literally strangling me. I was going in and out, and I couldn't breathe. I thought I was dead. And the next thing I knew, Tom was there knocking Granby off of me. And Tom said that I better be quiet and not talk to anyone, not say anything, or he's gonna come and get me. It put chills down my spine, and it literally terrified me.
Wendy Mazaris's marriage to Las Vegas mobster Tom Hanley has become an exercise in survival.
I felt more and more trapped. I felt like I was digging a deeper and deeper hole.
And Wendy's ties to Tom are about to be made deeper.
When I found out I was pregnant, I felt relieved again. If I'm pregnant, he's not gonna threaten to kill me anymore. Tom was very, very happy. that I was pregnant. He said, "Oh, you're gonna have a little gooser. I'm so happy for us." And it made me feel good that he felt good.
But Wendy is reminded that no one is safe from Tom, not even the mother of his child, when she stumbles on a keepsake from his past.
I was rearranging Tom's suits, and I found this note. It was his first wife's suicide note.
Officially, Tom's first wife died from an overdose of sleeping pills. But does this note tell another story? Wendy's gut reaction is to give the note to Tom, but she immediately regrets this.
Tom sat me down and said, "Now you're gonna write yours." And I said, "Why are you having me do this?" He said, "Just write it." And so he told me what to say. "Sorry, Tom, I can't go on anymore. Make sure our little gooser is well taken care of." What was going through my head at the time was, wow. I immediately went into survival mode again. I felt extremely insecure.
What kind of psychotic person does that who has his wife write a suicide note?
The suicide note was used to keep me under control. I was like his prisoner, and I would always have it in the back of my head that he has that suicide note. He can kill me at any minute.
In the winter of 1976, Wendy gives birth to a baby girl they name Amy.
I thought having a daughter, he would change a little bit, but he didn't. Tom started going to the deep end then. He started acting out, started just walking around like no one could touch him, started being mean to the people that he was around. We were at the Safeway store shopping. We were up at the cash register. Some guy had let me in because I had a new baby. He said, "Please go first." Tom took that completely wrong, pulled out his gun, stuck it to the guy's head, and said, "Don't talk to my wife." And the next thing I knew, we were running out of the store with this little baby.
Tom is quickly arrested and taken to the station, while police conduct a search at the house.
One detective said, "Are there any more guns in the house?" And I said, "Yeah, there's a lot." And I took him in, and they loaded up like 56 guns out of our room alone. Tom was up at the sheriff's office. They had not put him in a cell. They had not booked him. He called and he was screaming at the detective, "Leave my guns alone. I want my guns, and I'll be home in a minute." And they let him go. That made me think that Tom was very powerful with the sheriff's office, and he had connections there. They didn't even book him. They gave him back all of his guns, and they let him come home. All I wanted to do was take the baby and run. But at that point, I felt it was impossible because he would hunt me down and he would kill me. He had the suicide note, and he carried it around in his wallet.
Soon, Wendy will be digging her own grave. Literally.
He tells her, "Dig more, make it deeper." And she is frightened. He is renowned as a killer. You know this now for a fact, and you think you're digging your own grave. What else could she think other than he's gonna put bullets in the back of her head?
Hitman Tom Hanley's powerful influence over the police and the mob turns his wife Wendy into a prisoner. Wendy tries to normalize her life by focusing on happier moments. She relishes the times they spend with their close friends, Al and Barbara Bramlett.
We went to Barbara's house and had dinner. I liked Al too. I thought he was nice. making sure my pregnancy went okay and always asking questions how I felt. He seemed like a pretty genuine gentleman.
Al is the head of the culinary union, and its members are 25,000 strong.
Al Bramlett was the top person for Culinary 226. It's the most powerful union in Las Vegas, representing casino workers. He also uses that position to exert enormous influence and power to enrich himself and also to inflict violence on people who didn't bow to his will. Al Bramlett also used Tom Hanley to threaten people who didn't unionize.
It seemed to me that Tom really liked Al. He was one of his best friends of 36 years.
In late February 1977, Tom comes home unusually late one night.
He came in, gave me a big hug and said, "I love you." Then he walked to the laundry room, took off his clothes and put them in the washer. You could see little spits of blood on him. Then he pulled out this jewelry, and one was a tiger ring. Later on, we got a call from Al Bramlett's wife, Barbara. Barbara was asking Tom, "Have you seen Al? He didn't get off the plane."
When the media learns Al Bramlett is missing, it's big news.
We have checked with a number of persons who were closely associated with Mr. Bramlett. We have been unable to come up with any reason as to his disappearance.
I saw it on the news that Al Bramlett didn't come home. At that point, I thought, tiger ring. That scared me right there. Could have Tom gone and hurt Al? Where was he gone for so long? I thought to myself, he couldn't have killed one of his best friends of 36 years. He couldn't have hurt him. What did he do? The following day when we woke up, there was a detective from the sheriff's department at the door and tipped off Tom.
Tom leaves Wendy to deal with Las Vegas investigators by herself.
I let them in. They sat in the front room, and we're looking for Al Bramlett. "Do you know where he's at?" And I said, "No, I don't. I'm at home here with my baby." And they said, "Do you know what in the hell you're living with?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Your husband is a killer." It was the detective that came over earlier in the day that told Tom what was going on. That moment, I didn't trust anyone. I couldn't trust the cops. I couldn't trust Tom. Who was I to trust?
If police know about the thing that he's doing, and even they don't try to stop him, what are they going to do for her? Just another example of how trapped she was in this whole nightmare.
Tom turned up at home, and I told him about all the police, and Tom just said, "Oh, he'll show up. He'll show up. Don't worry." And then we started getting calls from Benny Binion, calls from other union leaders. I mean, that's the first time I've ever seen the phone ring off the hook.
Over the next 2 weeks, the police question Tom multiple times, but he continues to deny any involvement.
I thought they were protecting Tom. They're surely not asking him where Al Bramlett is. That's what kind of mindset I was in. Tom again leaves the city and he goes to Arizona.
Tom's very worried. He told Wendy that she would have to leave the house and never come back.
He had me so brainwashed at that point. Do what Tom tells you to do. I loaded up a bunch of boxes and documents and stuff, and they went into storage.
When Tom returns, he tells Wendy to arrange a sitter for Amy. He is taking Wendy for a drive in the desert.
And he kept assuring me everything was going to be okay, but I better keep my mouth shut.
Tom has a stash of clothes and jewelry he wants to get rid of.
We had a little ranch out in Pahrump. And he dug a hole, and he said, always remember where this is. I said, okay. He dropped the jewelry in the hole.
Then Tom plants a tree to mark the location.
In my mind, I'm thinking, is this really Al's jewelry? All I wanted was for Al to be okay. We got back in the vehicle. He pulls along the side of one of the canyons, and he said, come follow me. He says, start digging a hole. And he pulled out the gun, and he had it at the back of my head. And he said, start digging. So I got on my hands and knees, and I was digging with my hands.
By this time, Wendy has seen too much, and she is a liability for Tom.
And he cocked the gun, and I thought he was gonna kill me.
Tom Hanley is about to pull the trigger on his wife, Wendy Mazaris.
I started begging him, please, let me be with our daughter. She needs a mother. She needs a father. Please let me be with my daughter. And he let me up. And he let me get back up and walk to the truck. He turned to me and he said, you're probably right. Amy does need someone to be with her. And then we just started driving. All I could think to myself is the clothes that he had put in the hole smelled like Al Bramlett.
3 weeks after Al Bramlett disappears, hikers near Nevada's Potosi Mountain come across a gruesome sight.
The search for Al Bramlett has ended here in the desert just 2 weeks from the night he disappeared.
An autopsy shows he was executed with multiple gunshots to the head.
My heart sunk because I always in the back of my mind thought that Al was just going to show up, that maybe they had him tied up somewhere or something and everything was going to be okay, but it wasn't. He was gone.
After the news breaks, police pay another visit to Wendy.
They said, do you know who your husband is and what he does? And I said, he owns the air conditioning business. They said, no, he's one of the most prolific killers of all time. It was so shocking to hear that come out of homicide detectives' mouths. Was I in denial? Probably yes. Was I brainwashed? Yes. It was just a horrible, horrible life.
He was thought of to have killed an FBI agent, William Coulthard. He was thought to have bombed 2 restaurants, the Alpine Village and the Starboard Tack. The rationale was the Culinary Union wanted them in the union and they didn't want to unionize.
Tom has gotten away with murder before, but this time, a tipster gives police a break in the Al Bramlett murder case.
An informant came to them and said that he was there when Al Bramlett was killed and that he was with Tom and Granby Hanley, who actually did the killing.
The Hanleys were upset because a couple of bombs they had planted didn't go off at businesses in Las Vegas that Bramlett wanted blown up. So, according to the Hanleys, Bramlett didn't pay them for that, $10,000. So they go to shake down Al Bramlett.
Bramlett was kidnapped from the airport parking lot.
They go into the desert outside of Las Vegas. At some point, Tom says, hey, Al. Al turns around and he shoots him in the head. He ended up getting shot 6 times, including once in each ear. All his clothes were taken off of him. He was buried under a pile of rocks in the desert with his hand sticking up to wave goodbye to the world.
A warrant is put out for the father and son fugitives, and on April 29, 1977, Granby and Tom are arrested in Phoenix, Arizona.
It was a media frenzy, and it was a frenzy at the Hanley house as well.
It was astonishing news. It felt good. It really did. But it took a few days for it to sink in. Were they going to let him go again? Was he locked up for good? Tom really did kill one of his best friends. He took him out and he killed him, just like he was going to do to me.
Tom and Granby are flown from Phoenix to Las Vegas to be tried for murder. When they land, Tom gives a statement while in handcuffs.
I never had any animosity towards Al Bramlett. He was one of the best friends I ever had.
After Tom's arrest, a mobster friend convinces Wendy to tell him what she knows.
I went out to the little ranch in Pahrump and I pointed to the tree that Tom had dug and buried.
Underneath the tree, they find Al Bramlett's jewelry.
And then everything just went crazy. A helicopter came down, all kinds of police came from everywhere. We were pulled over, and the homicide detective said, "You're under arrest, baby." I did not realize that he was an informant and working undercover with the police. I'm thinking, I didn't kill anyone, I didn't do anything.
Wendy is charged with receiving stolen property and for murder.
When you're charged with such a substantial charge like that, your whole life flashes ahead of you. And then on one day, workers in the jail stopped the elevator, and then they pulled Tom in there in the elevator with me. And then he started telling me, "Don't you say anything, everything's gonna be all right." So he had connections all the way inside the jail too. There was never any escape because the environment that I lived in with Tom, all of his problems came on me. That's what happens when you live with somebody like that. You get blamed too. How do I get rid of this guy? He's still gonna haunt me. He still knows people. He's gonna hurt me one way or another. I went to court and the charge was reduced to accessory to murder. And eventually the charge was dropped. I still had to do a year probation, but I felt a tremendous relief when they knew I didn't have anything to do with it.
By early 1978, the trial creates a media circus, with Wendy trapped defending Tom for fear of reprisal.
Do you think that Tom can get a fair trial here in Las Vegas?
No, he can't.
Why is that?
Publicity.
Have you,
The publicity is destroying him.
On March 2nd, 1978, Tom and Granby plead guilty to the murder of Al Bramlett and the restaurant bombings. They are sentenced to life without parole.
He was found guilty, and just a big sigh of relief came over me again. If Tom would have walked out of that courtroom a free man, there would have been a lot of people dead. A lot of people.
In return for them giving information on the mob, Tom and Granby are placed into witness protection within the prison system.
I felt bad for our daughter, Amy. I was able to disassociate myself with him and stand back and see everything he put me through.
After the trial, Wendy moves to California and attends college to try and start a normal life. She is only 22 years old.
There is no depths to a man like Tom Hanley. Once you're in their world, it's very hard to escape. And it was for me. I had to learn the hard way.
Years after escaping Tom Hanley, Wendy finds the courage to tell her story. She publishes a book about her experience as a mob wife called Vegas Ragdoll. Today, Wendy has been happily married for 25 years. And unlike many men in her life, this one is special.
She definitely had guardian angels, probably one on each shoulder.
We're complete opposites, but he does love and he protects me. He's a true husband.
Wendy's a very loving, strong person with convictions that will carry to the end.
He accepts me for who I am. He's taught me how to trust a little bit more.
Yeah, she met me, and I guess I was like the savior of her life for real, because I'll never let anything happen to her.
He truly loves me, and I love him. And I searched and searched, and I finally found the right man, a good man.
The night California forgot how to sleep began with a sound no one could place, a sharp interruption cutting through the hum of a quiet coastal town in the spring of 1998, the kind of sound that doesn't announce itself as violence until much later, when memory rewinds and suddenly every second feels contaminated because somewhere between the last streetlight and the dark edge of the Pacific, a life slipped out of reach and left behind a question that would harden into a cold case, one that refused to stay buried. It was just after midnight when the call came in, fragmented, confused, a neighbor reporting a door left open, a car still warm, headlights dead but keys missing, the air carrying that uneasy stillness police learned to distrust, and when the first patrol car rolled up, tires crunching over gravel, the scene already felt wrong in ways that couldn't yet be articulated. Inside the small bungalow, nothing screamed robbery, nothing overturned, no blood pooling on the floor, just the soft glow of a television left running in an empty room and the faint smell of burned coffee curling from the kitchen, as if someone had been interrupted mid-thought and erased. This was how the cold case began, not with chaos, but with absence, with the unsettling clarity that someone was supposed to be here and wasn't. Her name would dominate headlines by morning, printed in stark black letters that flattened a complex life into a single line, but in that house she was still a presence, clothes folded on a chair, shoes lined neatly by the door, a half-written note on the counter that ended mid-sentence, the pen left uncapped, ink slowly bleeding into the paper like time leaking away. She was 32, local, known, the kind of person who waved to neighbors and remembered names, who worked a regular job and came home at predictable hours, which made her disappearance louder, more offensive to logic, because people like that don't just vanish. Outside, blue and red lights painted the street in jittery flashes, curious faces peeking through curtains, whispers already forming, and somewhere in the distance the ocean kept moving, indifferent, as it always does when humans stumble into tragedy. By sunrise, the word missing had been replaced with investigation, and then quickly with something heavier, colder, a phrase that would cling to this story for decades: cold case. Detectives moved through the house slowly, methodically, photographing every corner, bagging every object that might later explain what the present could not, but the evidence felt thin, almost mocking, fingerprints that belonged to her, fibers that told no story, a phone with its last call placed hours earlier to a number that led nowhere interesting. Outside, her car sat angled awkwardly near the curb, driver's door unlocked, purse still inside, cash untouched, a detail that rippled through the department because it broke pattern, because it whispered that whatever happened wasn't about money, wasn't random, wasn't simple. The community reacted the way communities always do when shock hits close to home, with vigils and flyers taped to telephone poles, with photos passed from hand to hand, eyes searching faces in grocery store aisles, gas stations, anywhere she might suddenly reappear, alive, apologetic, explaining it all away. Local news trucks parked at the end of the street, anchors practicing somber expressions, Phrases like mysterious disappearance and foul play suspected rolling off tongues that would soon move on to other stories. But here in this town, time slowed, stretched, became sticky, each day without answers adding weight, pressing down on families, on investigators, on a community that felt exposed, as if a thin protective layer had been peeled back to reveal how fragile routine really is. Detectives worked the angles they always work first: friends, co-workers, former partners, anyone whose proximity could be twisted into motive, sitting across from familiar faces in interview rooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee, asking the same questions in different ways, watching for flinches, pauses, the micro-expressions that sometimes betray secrets. They mapped her last known movements hour by hour, a coffee stop here, a phone call there, reconstructing a timeline that felt solid until it didn't, until gaps appeared where memory failed and alibis blurred. One witness remembered seeing her car near the freeway later than expected. Another swore they heard an argument carried on the wind, but nothing aligned cleanly, nothing locked into place. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the case cooled, not because it was forgotten, but because it refused to yield, because every promising lead dissolved under scrutiny. A man questioned aggressively lawyered up and disappeared from the narrative. A reported sighting hundreds of miles away collapsed when surveillance footage told a different story. A tip called in late one night sent officers racing to a remote stretch of coastline only to find empty sand and the relentless crash of waves. Each false hope took a toll, the emotional whiplash leaving families raw, detectives frustrated, the word cold, beginning to feel less like a procedural label and more like a description of the silence settling in. By the end of the first year, the file was thick but hollow, pages of notes, transcripts, photographs, none of them providing the one thing everyone needed: an answer. The case was reassigned, then reassigned again, passed between desks as personnel changed, each new detective bringing fresh eyes, only to run headfirst into the same brick walls. Technology at the time offered limited mercy. DNA testing was crude by modern standards, databases sparse, the idea of future breakthroughs little more than hope whispered in hallways. Evidence was boxed, labeled, stored, the physical remnants of a mystery placed on shelves that sagged under the weight of other unsolved lives. And yet, the story refused to die. On anniversaries, local papers ran brief updates: still no arrests, families still waiting, the words becoming ritual, a reminder that closure had not arrived. The community carried the case like a shared scar, parents warning children to be careful, doors locking earlier at night, a subtle shift in behavior that spoke volumes about trust eroded. For the family, time moved differently, measured not in holidays or birthdays but in the ache of not knowing, in the daily ritual of imagining different endings, some hopeful, some unbearable. Years later, when detectives reopened the cold case with renewed urgency, armed with advances that had once seemed like science fiction, they would return to this beginning, to that quiet house, that open door, that unfinished note, searching again for meaning hidden in plain sight. But in 1998, standing amid the flashing lights and the curious stares, no one could have predicted that this disappearance would stretch across decades, that it would become a case study in patience and persistence, a reminder that some truths sink deep, waiting, silent, for the moment when the right question finally cracks the surface. For now, all anyone knew was that a woman was gone, a community was shaken, and somewhere in the shadows, a story had begun that refused to end, a California cold case that would haunt everyone who touched it, long after the sirens faded and the night tried, unsuccessfully, to move on. The second year crept in quietly, without ceremony, without the urgency that had once driven patrol cars through the neighborhood at all hours, and what remained was a case that lived mostly on paper, its pulse faint but stubborn, waiting for someone to notice it still breathed. Inside the department, the cold case file began to acquire a reputation, the kind detectives speak about in lowered voices, a story that had consumed time and produced nothing, a reminder that not every disappearance bends to procedure or persistence. Yet certain details refused to fade, refusing to sit politely in the past, like the fact that her routine had been almost aggressively ordinary, the kind of predictability investigators usually cling to because patterns are supposed to be exploitable, and here, the pattern had shattered without warning. When the new lead detective first opened the file, years after the night she vanished, the smell of dust and old paper rose from the boxes, an archive of frustration sealed in cardboard. He read everything from the beginning, not skimming, not trusting the conclusions of those before him, forcing himself to feel the rhythm of the case as it unfolded, the early confidence, the mounting confusion, the slow cooling into something like resignation. He noticed what others had dismissed as background noise, a neighbor's offhand comment about unfamiliar footsteps, a co-worker's vague recollection of a tense phone call weeks earlier, details that had once seemed too thin to support theories, but now felt heavier when revisited with fresh eyes. The town itself had changed in subtle ways, new businesses opening where old ones had closed, children growing into adults who barely remembered the woman whose face still stared out from faded flyers taped behind bulletin boards, but beneath that surface, the unease lingered. Every time another cold case made headlines somewhere else, solved by DNA or a deathbed confession, the question resurfaced here too, whispered in diners and online forums. Why not this one? What made this disappearance so resistant to truth? Armchair investigators built elaborate theories late at night, connecting dots that official investigators couldn't publicly acknowledge, some accusing former suspects, others inventing strangers who drifted through town and vanished just as cleanly, each theory adding to the noise, none delivering clarity. Inside the evidence boxes, physical objects waited patiently, unaware of the years sliding past. The half-written note was still there, ink preserved under plastic, its abrupt ending analyzed endlessly, linguists debating whether the phrasing suggested interruption or hesitation, whether the final word hinted at someone else's presence or merely reflected fatigue. Fibers collected from the car upholstery were re-examined under improved microscopes, their origins narrowed, but never narrowed enough. The phone records, once limited to basic call logs, were now scrutinized for patterns, frequencies, anomalies, detectives asking questions technology hadn't been able to answer before, questions that still stopped just short of revelation. One detail continued to gnaw at investigators, a reported sighting that had been dismissed early on because it conflicted with the established timeline, a gas station attendant who claimed to have seen her late that night, alone, appearing distracted, almost distressed. At the time, the sighting didn't fit, the timestamp fuzzy, the memory uncertain, and so it slid quietly into the background. Years later, with the benefit of distance and a willingness to challenge old assumptions, it resurfaced, tugged back into the light, forcing detectives to reconsider whether the timeline itself had been wrong from the start, whether the window of opportunity had been wider than anyone realized. Re-interviewing witnesses was an exercise in patience and psychology, memories altered by time, by conversations, by news reports, by the simple human need to fill gaps with something that feels like certainty. Some people were eager to talk again, grateful that someone still cared, while others were defensive, irritated by the resurrection of a chapter they'd hoped was closed. One former acquaintance stumbled over details they'd once delivered confidently, contradictions slipping out unguarded, not enough to accuse, but enough to raise eyebrows. Another admitted, almost casually, that they'd lied years earlier about something minor, afraid it would make them look suspicious, a confession that sent ripples through the investigative team, because if one lie had survived this long, how many others had gone undetected? The emotional toll of reopening the cold case was immediate and sharp for the family, hope flaring despite years of self-protection, despite promises they'd made to themselves not to expect miracles. Each phone call from detectives tightened chests, reopened wounds that never fully healed, the pain of not knowing refreshed with every new question. They revisited the house, long since sold, walking through rooms that now belonged to strangers, pointing out where things had been found, reliving that night in fragments that refused to settle into a coherent whole. As technology advanced, so did the sense of possibility, but with it came a cruel irony. The better the tools became, the more glaring the absence of definitive evidence felt. DNA extracted from items once considered useless yielded partial profiles, tantalizing but incomplete, ghosts in databases that didn't yet exist when the crime was fresh. Each hit that almost matched, that hovered just outside certainty, felt like a door slammed shut inches from the finish line. Investigators learned to temper excitement, to distrust the rush that came with potential breakthroughs, because disappointment had become a familiar companion. Rumors persisted that someone knew something, that a conversation overheard years ago, a drunken confession, a careless remark, had been dismissed or ignored, and detectives chased those rumors with a mix of skepticism and desperation. Anonymous tips poured in, some clearly fueled by imagination, others disturbingly specific, describing locations, actions, motives that sent teams back into the field, combing through remote areas, rewalking terrain that had already been searched, hoping time or erosion might have revealed what eyes once missed. Each search ended the same way, with nothing tangible to show, just the physical exhaustion of effort and the mental weight of unanswered questions. The case began to take on a mythic quality within the department, a measuring stick for resolve, a reminder given to rookies that not every story ends neatly, that justice isn't always swift or visible. Some detectives avoided it, unwilling to inherit its baggage, while others felt drawn to it, convinced that persistence alone might eventually crack it open. Meetings stretched late into the night, whiteboards filled with names and arrows, theories sketched and erased, the same facts rearranged in endless permutations, as if the right configuration might suddenly reveal a hidden pattern. And still, the absence at the heart of the case remained untouched, the unanswered question of where she went, what she encountered, whether the truth lay buried somewhere physical or trapped forever in human silence. The cold case existed now as both an investigation and a cautionary tale, a story told in training rooms and over late-night coffee, a reminder that some mysteries don't announce themselves with violence or spectacle, but with a quiet disruption, a door left open, a life paused mid-sentence. As another anniversary passed, candles flickered again on the sidewalk, faces illuminated briefly before darkness reclaimed them, and the ocean continued its endless rhythm nearby, waves erasing footprints as quickly as they appeared. Somewhere between memory and reality, the case waited, suspended in time, unresolved, unsatisfied, daring anyone who touched it to believe that persistence might still matter, that even after years of silence, the truth could still be listening, just beyond reach, just out of sight, refusing to reveal itself, but never quite letting go. By the time the case entered its second decade, it no longer belonged only to the department or the family. It belonged to the town's collective memory, to the uneasy space between what was known and what was feared, and that made every new development feel heavier, more dangerous, as if disturbing the past might invite consequences no one could predict. Detectives noticed it in the way people reacted when her name was mentioned, the sudden pauses, the looks exchanged, the instinctive lowering of voices, because unsolved cases don't age quietly, they ferment, turning speculation into folklore, suspicion into background noise that never quite fades. The reopened investigation began to focus less on what had happened inside the house, and more on what had happened just beyond it, the minutes and meters after she crossed that invisible line between safety and vulnerability. Traffic patterns from that night were reconstructed using old municipal records, a crude puzzle assembled from incomplete data, and slowly a picture emerged of a town that hadn't been as asleep as everyone remembered. A late-night delivery truck reported a delay near the freeway entrance. A rideshare company, barely established at the time, unearthed logs showing unusual activity in the area. None of it was definitive, but it chipped away at the assumption that she had vanished into a vacuum. One name surfaced again and again in the margins of the file, never bolded, never circled in red, just present enough to be annoying. A man who lived nearby in 1998, whose connection to her was tenuous at best, a neighbor's acquaintance, someone who waved in passing but never crossed into friendship. He had been interviewed early on, cooperative, forgettable, offering an alibi that checked out on paper, and then he slid quietly out of focus. Years later, When detectives traced his movements after 1998, they noticed a pattern of abrupt relocations, jobs abandoned without explanation, a restlessness that could be nothing or could be everything, depending on how much weight you wanted to give coincidence. Re-interviewing him was awkward, time having reshaped both sides of the table. He was older now, more guarded, the confidence of youth replaced by something sharper, more defensive. His answers came quickly, too quickly, rehearsed in a way that suggested he'd been expecting this moment for years. When asked about the night she disappeared, his story hadn't changed, but the emotion around it had, irritation flashing where there had once been indifference, a subtle shift that didn't translate into evidence but lodged itself in the detective's instincts like a splinter. Instincts, however, don't hold up in court, and so the interview ended the way so many others had, with polite smiles masking unresolved tension. Meanwhile, forensic science continued its slow march forward, and with it came a renewed examination of the car, still preserved in a controlled facility, a relic of an era when investigators hadn't known what questions to ask of it. New techniques pulled trace evidence from seams and surfaces once considered clean, minute particles that hinted at contact with another environment, another vehicle, another place. Soil analysis suggested she'd been somewhere other than her neighborhood that night, a location inland, dry, inconsistent with the coastal air she lived in. It was a clue that pointed outward, away from the tidy narrative of a crime contained within familiar borders. The idea that she'd been taken somewhere else reframed everything, forcing investigators to widen their scope, to look at remote areas that had once seemed irrelevant, stretches of land that had changed dramatically over the years, developed, eroded, transformed by human hands and natural forces. Old maps were overlaid with new ones, satellite imagery compared across decades, searching for disturbances, anomalies, anything that might suggest a hidden history beneath the present. Search teams revisited areas that had been scoured years earlier, hoping that time itself might have done what human eyes could not. Public interest flared again as news of the renewed investigation leaked, headlines cautiously optimistic, careful not to promise closure, but eager to capture attention. Tips flooded in, the volume overwhelming, a mix of genuine concern and opportunism, people eager to insert themselves into a story that had never truly ended. Some tips were chillingly specific, describing actions only someone involved might know, but when pressed, the details unraveled, memories borrowed from news coverage, imagination filling gaps where truth should have been. The line between insight and interference blurred, complicating the work of those tasked with separating signal from noise. Within the department, pressure mounted, not just to solve the case, but to justify the resources being poured into it, to prove that reopening old wounds served a purpose beyond symbolism. Younger detectives, raised on stories of cold cases cracked by persistence and technology, pushed hard, convinced that the answer was there, waiting, while veterans urged caution, aware of how easily hope could outrun reality. Tensions flared in meetings, theories clashed, alliances shifted, the case exerting a gravitational pull that distorted judgment, tempting even seasoned investigators to see patterns where none existed. For the family, the renewed attention was a double-edged blade, reopening doors they'd tried to close, forcing them to relive moments they'd spent years trying to compartmentalize. They watched the news carefully, reading between lines, analyzing body language, clinging to phrases that hinted at progress while bracing for disappointment. In private, they argued about what they wanted more, answers or peace, knowing that one might come at the expense of the other. As the investigation pushed forward, one truth became increasingly clear. The case was no longer just about what happened in 1998, but about everything that had happened since, the decisions made, the leads followed or ignored, the ways time had both obscured and illuminated the past. Every new discovery carried with it the weight of years lost, opportunities missed, and the haunting possibility that the truth had brushed against investigators before, unnoticed, unrecognized, and slipped away again. And so the cold case pressed on, reshaped by time but no less heavy, its core questions still unanswered, its presence felt in every late-night meeting, every reopened box, every uneasy glance exchanged when someone wondered, silently, whether the key to the mystery had been in their hands all along, whether the silence that followed her disappearance was not empty at all, but crowded with secrets, waiting for the moment when someone would finally listen closely enough to hear them speak. As the investigation pressed deeper into its third decade, a new kind of tension settled over the case, quieter than the chaos of the early years but far more suffocating, the tension of knowing that time itself was becoming an adversary. Witnesses were aging, memories thinning, some names in the file now marked with a stark finality, deceased, taking whatever they knew into the ground. Every loss felt irreversible, a door closing forever, and detectives began to work with a sharpened urgency, aware that the window for human testimony was narrowing with each passing year. Attention shifted toward relationships that had once seemed too mundane to matter, the everyday interactions that rarely leave a dramatic footprint but often hide the deepest fractures. Her coworkers were re-examined, not as a group, but as individuals, their dynamics mapped carefully, subtle conflicts resurfacing in hindsight. One colleague admitted to a rivalry that had never been documented, a tension over promotions, over recognition, something small enough at the time to dismiss, but large enough to fuel resentment. Another described a pattern of late-night calls that had felt inappropriate, uncomfortable, yet had never crossed into anything actionable, a reminder that warning signs often register only after it's too late. The digital shadows of 1998 were faint, but not non-existent, and investigators began mining what little data remained, archived emails, early internet forum posts, fragments of communication preserved on obsolete servers. It was painstaking work, translating formats no longer supported, reconstructing conversations that had taken place in a digital world still in its infancy. In one recovered exchange, she mentioned feeling watched, a fleeting comment buried in casual conversation, easily overlooked at the time, now impossible to ignore. The context was unclear, the tone ambiguous, but the implication lingered, adding a layer of unease to a case already saturated with it. The neighborhood where she'd lived was no longer the same, renovated, repainted, the original layout altered to suit new owners, but beneath the cosmetic changes, the bones remained, and investigators walked the area again, this time with a different lens. They measured sightlines, distances, angles of approach, asking whether someone could have watched a routine without drawing attention, whether the familiarity of the environment had been used against her. A nearby alley, once dismissed as irrelevant, now seemed like a convenient blind spot, a place where a confrontation could unfold unseen, seconds stretching into eternity without witnesses. Community members were approached carefully, aware that trust had eroded over the years, that some still resented law enforcement for failing to deliver answers. Conversations unfolded in living rooms and backyards, away from recorders and uniforms, people sharing stories they'd never formalized, half memories, gut feelings, moments that had felt wrong but hadn't seemed important enough to report. One longtime resident recalled a vehicle idling on the street for weeks before the disappearance, its driver never exiting, never engaging, just watching. Another spoke of a stranger asking questions about her schedule, framed as casual curiosity, now reinterpreted through the harsh light of hindsight. The suspect list grew and shrank in cycles, names added, scrutinized, then quietly removed when evidence failed to materialize. Frustration simmered as detectives confronted the limitations of their craft, the uncomfortable truth that intuition and effort were not always enough. They debated whether the case involved someone local, someone who knew the rhythms of the town, or an outsider who had passed through briefly, leaving chaos in their wake. Each theory carried implications that rippled outward, shaping how resources were allocated, how interviews were conducted, how hope was managed. In parallel, the forensic team revisited items that had once been considered exhausted, applying methods that bordered on experimental, extracting new information from old materials. Trace chemicals on her clothing suggested exposure to substances uncommon in residential areas, hinting at industrial or agricultural environments, places she had no known reason to be. The discovery deepened the mystery, expanding the map of possibilities and complicating an already tangled narrative. Each new clue seemed to answer one question while spawning three more, a hydra of uncertainty that refused to be slain. Media coverage intensified again, drawn by the novelty of advanced science applied to a decades-old mystery, and with it came scrutiny, speculation, and pressure. Headlines flirted with certainty, teasing breakthroughs that never quite arrived, and detectives found themselves navigating not just the case, but its public perception, careful to guard details that could contaminate future testimony. The family watched all of this unfold from the sidelines, caught between gratitude for renewed attention and exhaustion from reliving the worst chapter of their lives under a spotlight that offered no warmth. Privately, some investigators began to question whether the truth was still reachable, whether too much time had passed, too many opportunities squandered, but those doubts rarely surfaced aloud. To admit defeat felt like a betrayal, not just of the victim, but of the ideal that persistence eventually triumphs. And yet, the case seemed to resist resolution with a stubbornness that felt almost intentional, as if the past were actively pushing back against intrusion. Late nights were spent alone in evidence rooms, detectives staring at photographs until details blurred, hoping repetition might unlock insight. They imagined scenarios, replayed possibilities, asking themselves what they would have done differently, what assumptions they might have made unconsciously, what biases could have shaped early decisions. The weight of responsibility pressed down, heavy and unrelenting, because every unanswered question represented not just a professional failure, but a human one. And through it all, the silence at the heart of the cold case endured, unbroken, a void that refused to yield its secrets. It lingered in the spaces between words during interviews, in the pauses before difficult questions, in the looks exchanged when investigators realized they were circling familiar ground again. The case remained alive, active, unresolved, a testament to the complexity of human behavior and the limits of certainty, a reminder that some mysteries don't fade with time. They deepen, growing darker, heavier, until the search for answers becomes as much about confronting that darkness as it is about escaping it. The fifth wave of inquiry arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet recalibration, a recognition that brute force persistence had yielded diminishing returns and that the case needed to be approached sideways, from angles previously considered too speculative, too uncomfortable, or too politically inconvenient. Investigators began to scrutinize not just people, but systems, asking how procedure itself might have shaped the narrative, how early assumptions could have funneled attention away from truths that didn't fit neatly into reports or press briefings. The cold case was no longer treated as a frozen moment in 1998, but as a living organism, altered by every decision made since, each choice leaving fingerprints invisible but consequential. Internal reviews exposed gaps that were difficult to confront, interviews that had been too brief, tips that had been logged but never fully explored, decisions influenced by the pressure of public reassurance rather than evidentiary rigor. No single error stood out as catastrophic, but together they formed a pattern of missed nuance, the kind that only becomes obvious in retrospect. Detectives revisiting those early days felt a creeping discomfort, the realization that certainty had sometimes been mistaken for progress, that the desire to calm a shaken community might have dulled the instinct to question even the most plausible explanations. A particularly troubling thread emerged around the handling of anonymous tips in the first months after the disappearance. Hundreds had poured in, overwhelming the system, and triage had been necessary, but in that process, subtlety had suffered. One tip, buried deep in the archive, described a confrontation near a service road outside town, a woman matching her description seen arguing with a man beside a vehicle that didn't belong there. At the time, the report lacked corroboration, its timing uncertain, and it was quietly deprioritized. Now, with fresh eyes and a broader understanding of the night's geography, the tip took on new weight, aligning uncomfortably well with later forensic findings that suggested she'd been moved inland. Tracking down the source of that tip proved nearly impossible, the phone number long disconnected, the voice reduced to a line of text on aging paper, a reminder of how easily crucial moments slip through procedural cracks. Still, the image lingered, vivid and unsettling, and investigators began to build hypothetical timelines around it, asking what kind of person would know about that service road, what purpose they might have had there at that hour, and how such an encounter could unfold without immediate witnesses. The focus shifted again to mobility, to vehicles and routes, to the arteries that connected the town to its hinterlands. Old traffic camera footage, grainy and incomplete, was reanalyzed frame by frame, modern software enhancing details once lost to noise. A vehicle of interest appeared briefly, indistinct but persistent, its presence statistically anomalous for that time of night. The license plate remained unreadable, the make and model only roughly identified, but its repeated appearance along a corridor leading inland reignited theories of premeditation, of someone who knew exactly where to go to avoid attention. As these possibilities gained traction, investigators found themselves navigating delicate ethical terrain, aware that revisiting old suspicions could upend lives built in the years since. Some former persons of interest had families now, careers, reputations anchored in the assumption of innocence that time had granted them. Yet the mandate of the cold case unit was clear: truth over comfort, answers over convenience. Interviews resumed, letters sent, doors knocked on after decades of silence, reactions ranging from weary cooperation to thinly veiled hostility. One interview, conducted in a modest suburban home far from the coast, left a lasting impression. The subject, once peripheral to the case, reacted with visible shock to questions about that night, insisting they'd put it behind them, insisting they'd already told everything they knew. But as the conversation unfolded, inconsistencies surfaced, small but persistent, details about timing and location that shifted under pressure. Again, nothing rose to the level of proof, but the encounter reinforced a growing suspicion that the case's greatest obstacle wasn't a lack of evidence, but a surplus of half-truths. Meanwhile, the forensic narrative grew more complex, not simpler. Chemical residues, once thought incidental, now appeared intentional, suggesting the use of cleaning agents or industrial materials not commonly encountered by chance. The implication was chilling, pointing toward someone with access to such substances, someone comfortable operating outside domestic environments. Cross-referencing employment records from the late 90s revealed several possibilities, none conclusive, all unsettling, each opening new investigative paths that branched endlessly outward. Public reaction oscillated between renewed hope and creeping cynicism, online forums dissecting every leaked detail, every offhand comment from officials, sometimes drawing conclusions far ahead of the facts. The cold case had become a mirror for collective anxiety, a canvas onto which fears about safety, trust, and the passage of time were projected. Detectives monitored this discourse carefully, aware that misinformation could poison future testimony, but also recognizing that somewhere in the noise, a genuine insight might be hiding. For the family, the process felt like an emotional pendulum, swinging violently between anticipation and despair. They were consulted more frequently now, asked to revisit memories they'd rehearsed countless times, each retelling stripping away another layer of emotional protection. They wanted answers, but they also wanted an end to the cycle, an end to the constant reopening of wounds that never fully closed. Their resilience became both a source of admiration and a quiet indictment of how long the case had dragged on. As the fifth phase of investigation drew on, a sobering truth settled over everyone involved. The cold case was no longer just about discovering what happened, but about reckoning with how uncertainty reshapes lives over time. Every delay, every unanswered question had consequences that rippled outward, altering decisions, relationships, perceptions of safety and justice. The case had become a study in endurance, not just of law enforcement, but of human hope, stretched thin but not yet broken, clinging to the belief that even after years of silence, the past could still be persuaded to speak, if approached with enough humility, patience, and resolve. The sixth chapter of the investigation unfolded under a quieter sky, the kind that suggests calm while hiding pressure beneath the surface, because by now the cold case had reached a critical psychological threshold. It was no longer driven by novelty or public outrage, but by something more brittle and dangerous, the fear that the truth might slip away not through deception, but through attrition. Detectives felt it in the urgency of their conversations, in the way deadlines were invented where none officially existed, in the unspoken awareness that this case was beginning to ask a different question, not who did this, but whether the system was still capable of hearing the answer, if it finally arrived. Attention turned inward again, toward the victim herself, not as a symbol or a headline, but as a person whose internal world might have left subtle traces behind. Behavioral analysts were brought in to re-examine her routines, her choices, her communications, not looking for blame, but for context, for deviations that might signal a looming disruption. They traced shifts in her schedule, minor changes in habits that had once seemed inconsequential, a different route home taken more often, a gym membership used sporadically, late evenings that hadn't been accounted for. None of it screamed danger, but together it suggested a life under mild but persistent strain, the kind that rarely draws attention until it's too late. Private journals were reviewed again, passages reread with a sensitivity that hadn't been possible in the early days when investigators had been racing against the clock. Some entries hinted at unease, at a sense of being boxed in by circumstances she couldn't fully articulate. There were references to obligations she felt trapped by, to conversations that left her unsettled without clear reasons why. Analysts debated whether these were merely reflections of ordinary stress or signals of something darker encroaching on her life, something she herself hadn't yet recognized as a threat. The cold case unit began consulting experts outside traditional law enforcement, criminologists, psychologists, even sociologists, people who studied how crimes age, how narratives ossify, how truth can become distorted not by lies but by repetition. They warned that the longer a case remains unsolved, the more it becomes shaped by its own mythology, investigators unconsciously gravitating toward familiar theories, overlooking outliers that don't fit the established story. It was a sobering assessment, forcing the team to confront the possibility that they had been circling the same ground for years, mistaking motion for progress. One such outlier emerged from a reanalysis of her financial records, a detail that had been skimmed early on and filed away as unremarkable. Small, irregular transactions appeared in the months before her disappearance, amounts too modest to attract suspicion, yet consistent enough to suggest a pattern. They didn't align with known expenses or documented relationships, and their timing raised questions. Investigators explored whether she had been helping someone quietly, whether money had been used as leverage, whether generosity had been exploited by someone who understood her well enough to stay beneath the radar. Following that thread led investigators into a web of peripheral figures, people who existed on the edges of her life, acquaintances rather than friends, names that rarely appeared in official narratives. Some were cooperative, others evasive, but one stood out for the intensity of his reaction, bristling at questions that seemed routine, insisting on irrelevance with a fervor that felt disproportionate. Again, nothing concrete emerged, but the interaction left behind a residue of suspicion that refused to wash away. At the same time, new forensic reviews produced unsettling results. Advanced analysis of materials recovered from the car suggested deliberate attempts to obscure trace evidence, actions taken not in panic, but with methodical intent. This wasn't the work of someone improvising under stress, but of someone who had planned, who had considered contingencies. The implication shifted the tone of the investigation, narrowing the field toward individuals capable of foresight, of control, of operating without leaving obvious fingerprints. The idea that the crime had been planned challenged long-held assumptions, forcing investigators to revisit motives with a colder lens. The crimes of opportunity suddenly seemed less plausible, replaced by theories of fixation, of grudges nurtured quietly over time. Analysts constructed profiles, careful not to overfit the data, outlining characteristics rather than faces, emphasizing patience, familiarity, and an ability to blend into the background. The profile was unsettlingly ordinary, describing someone who could exist unnoticed, trusted enough not to raise alarms, invisible until the moment they weren't. Public awareness dipped during this phase, the absence of dramatic announcements causing attention to drift elsewhere, and in that lull, investigators worked with fewer distractions, fewer leaks, fewer expectations. It was during this quieter period that some of the most meaningful work occurred, connections tested slowly, hypotheses stress-tested rather than rushed to the press. The cold case breathed differently now, less frantic, more deliberate, as if it too had matured, shedding early chaos in favor of grim persistence. For the family, the silence was difficult to interpret. Fewer updates didn't mean less work, but it felt like retreat, and reassurance had to be offered carefully, without promises that couldn't be kept. They clung to small signs, a return call, a meeting scheduled, anything that suggested the case still mattered. Their patience had become legendary within the department, a quiet force that motivated detectives even when doubt threatened to creep in. As months passed without resolution, the investigation reached an inflection point, the realization that any breakthrough would likely come not from a single dramatic discovery, but from accumulation, from the slow alignment of details that had been drifting independently for years. The cold case was no longer a frozen snapshot of 1998, but a layered structure built over time, each layer adding complexity, each one requiring careful excavation. And beneath it all, the central question remained intact, untouched by analysis or technology, hovering like a low, persistent hum. Where did she go, and who knew enough to make her disappear so completely? The longer the silence endured, the more it felt intentional, engineered, as if the absence itself was part of the design, daring investigators to prove that time alone could not protect the truth, that even after decades of waiting, the past could still be called to account, if someone was willing to listen long enough to hear what it had been trying to say all along. By the seventh phase, the investigation had settled into a strange duality, outwardly calm, inwardly volatile, like a fault line that looks stable right up until the moment it breaks. Detectives were no longer chasing every lead, they were curating them, weighing each against years of accumulated context, asking not just whether something was possible, but whether it was probable, whether it fit the psychological and logistical shape that had slowly emerged. The cold case had matured into something unforgiving, intolerant of coincidence, suspicious of easy answers, demanding coherence where once it had accepted fragments. A breakthrough, if it could be called that, came not from new evidence, but from a reframing of old testimony, a decision to listen not for what was said, but for what had been avoided. Analysts revisited early interviews with a focus on language patterns, pauses, deflections, the moments when witnesses had volunteered information versus the moments they'd needed to be prompted. One interview, nearly forgotten, stood out in this new light, a person who had answered every question thoroughly, yet never once mentioned a specific time window that others had referenced naturally. It was a subtle omission, easy to miss, but once noticed, it echoed loudly, suggesting not ignorance, but calculation. That realization triggered a cascade of reevaluations. Timelines were reconstructed yet again, this time anchored not to reported events but to human behavior, to what people tend to remember instinctively when recounting stressful nights. When certain accounts failed that test, investigators circled them carefully, not accusing, not confronting, but observing how those individuals responded to renewed attention. Some grew defensive, others oddly relieved, as if grateful to finally be seen again, to have the weight of unspoken knowledge acknowledged, even obliquely. One such individual agreed to a follow-up interview after years of silence, requesting no recording, no formal statement, just a conversation. The meeting took place in a neutral location, daylight filtering through wide windows, an atmosphere deliberately stripped of intimidation. At first, the discussion wandered, touching on the town, the passage of time, the ways memory plays tricks, but gradually it edged closer to the night in question. The individual's voice tightened, words slowing, and though nothing explicit was confessed, the subtext was heavy. The implication that there were things known but never shared, not out of malice, but fear of being pulled into a story that had already consumed so many lives. That fear became a focal point for investigators, prompting a deeper exploration of the social dynamics surrounding the case in 1998. Who had reason to stay silent and why? They mapped relationships not by closeness, but by vulnerability, identifying individuals who might have felt exposed by the truth, even if they weren't directly responsible. The idea that the case had been protected not by a single secret, but by a network of quiet self-preservation, began to take hold, a collective silence built from individual decisions to look away. Forensic timelines continued to evolve alongside these insights. Environmental analysis suggested that if she had been moved inland, it likely occurred within a narrow window, a period when traffic was light but not non-existent, when risk could be managed by someone confident and familiar with the terrain. This narrowed focus breathed new life into the vehicle sightings from years earlier, prompting renewed attempts to identify owners whose movements aligned with that window. Records were incomplete, some lost, others sealed or purged, but persistence yielded a short list of possibilities, none definitive, all troubling. As pressure mounted internally, the cold case unit faced scrutiny from oversight bodies questioning the cost and value of continued investigation. Meetings grew tense, resources defended with arguments rooted not just in justice, but in institutional integrity. To abandon the case now, detectives argued, would be to concede that time can defeat truth, that patience is finite, that some lives simply expire beyond accountability. The debate was less about budget and more about philosophy, about what society owes its unanswered questions. In the midst of this, an unexpected development shifted the emotional landscape. A long-retired officer reached out quietly, requesting a private meeting. Age had softened his voice but sharpened his urgency, and he spoke of doubts he'd carried for years, about decisions made in the frantic early days, about a lead he dismissed too quickly because it conflicted with prevailing assumptions. He provided no smoking gun, no names, but his candor reframed the past, validating the team's growing suspicion that the case's greatest enemy had been momentum, the rush to stabilize a shaken community at the expense of deeper uncertainty. The conversation lingered with investigators long after it ended, reinforcing a truth they had come to understand intimately. Cold cases don't just cool, they calcify, their early shapes hardening into forms that resist alteration. Breaking them requires not just new evidence, but the humility to admit that the first story told may have been incomplete or even wrong. Publicly, little changed. No arrests were announced, no dramatic revelations offered to satisfy curiosity. But privately, the case felt closer to something, not resolution exactly, but alignment, pieces beginning to point in the same direction, even if they hadn't yet locked together. The absence at the center of the story felt less like a void and more like a presence, a pressure guiding the investigation, insisting on attention. As the seventh phase drew to a close, detectives found themselves standing at an uncomfortable edge, aware that the next steps would require confrontation, not just with individuals, but with the accumulated weight of years of silence. The cold case was no longer asking to be solved politely. It was demanding risk, demanding that assumptions be challenged and reputations unsettled, demanding that the question everyone had lived with for so long finally be asked out loud, not as speculation, but as an accusation waiting for proof, echoing in the quiet spaces where truth has a habit of hiding until it's ready to be found. The eighth movement of the case arrived with a subtle shift in gravity, the sense that the investigation was no longer circling the truth, but beginning to feel its pull, a quiet pressure drawing disparate threads inward whether anyone was ready or not. Detectives noticed it first in the way conversations changed, less hypothetical, more precise, names spoken with care, implications weighed before being voiced. The cold case had entered a phase where every action carried consequence, where asking the wrong question too loudly could send fragile cooperation collapsing into silence again. A new analytical sweep focused on proximity, not just physical closeness to the victim, but temporal proximity to the decisions that had shaped the investigation's early course. Who had influenced which leads were pursued, which were shelved, which assumptions hardened fastest. This wasn't about misconduct in the criminal sense, but about human bias, about how authority and confidence can steer collective belief. The realization was uncomfortable but necessary because it reframed the case as something that had been shaped as much by interpretation as by fact. One name, long familiar yet strangely underexamined, began to surface with increasing regularity, not as a suspect, but as a pivot point, someone whose statements had quietly anchored multiple timelines. His accounts had been consistent, almost too consistent, and when analysts compared them against evolving forensic windows, small discrepancies emerged, seconds stretched, minutes compressed, the kind of distortions that can be accidental or deliberate. Investigators didn't rush this revelation. They let it breathe, testing it against other data, watching to see if it collapsed or held. At the same time, a forensic re-examination of archived materials yielded an unexpected development. A sample once deemed too degraded for meaningful analysis produced a partial result under newer methods, not enough to identify, but enough to exclude. Several long-standing persons of interest were quietly crossed off internal lists, narrowing the field in a way that felt both relieving and terrifying. With fewer possibilities, the remaining ones loomed larger, harder to ignore, their implications more destabilizing. The vehicle sightings from years earlier took on renewed urgency. Investigators coordinated with external agencies, widening the net beyond county lines, tapping into databases that hadn't existed when the case began. Patterns emerged, faint but persuasive, linking certain movements to periods of heightened activity around the town. Again, nothing definitive, but the convergence was enough to justify deeper scrutiny, enough to unsettle those who recognized themselves in the questions being asked. Interviews resumed with a sharper edge, still controlled, still respectful, but no longer purely exploratory. Investigators listened for cracks, for shifts in tone when familiar ground was revisited under new framing. In one interview, a subject reacted not to the question itself, but to a detail embedded within it, a piece of information that hadn't been publicly known. The reaction was brief, almost imperceptible, but it registered, a flicker of recognition where there should have been none. The room went quiet in the way it does when something important has just happened, when everyone senses it but no one acknowledges it yet. That moment rippled outward, influencing strategy, reinforcing the decision to proceed carefully, incrementally, avoiding the temptation to confront without certainty. The cold case had waited too long to be jeopardized by impatience. Investigators documented everything obsessively, building a foundation designed to withstand scrutiny not just from courts, but from history itself. They understood now that if the case ever moved forward decisively, it would do so under an unforgiving spotlight. Outside the department, whispers grew louder. People sensed movement even without official confirmation, an undercurrent of anticipation spreading through the community. Longtime residents speculated quietly, revisiting old conversations, reevaluating relationships through the lens of possibility. The case had become personal again, not a relic, but a living question pressing against the present. Some welcomed this resurgence, believing accountability was overdue. Others recoiled, afraid of what might surface, of how revelations could fracture the fragile peace built over years of not knowing. The family, ever present at the edge of developments, felt the shift most acutely. Meetings with investigators carried a different tone now, less tentative, more deliberate. They were told not what was certain, but what was narrowing, what was aligning, and though the language remained careful, hope crept in despite every instinct to resist it. They had learned the cost of hope, but they also understood that this moment, whatever it led to, felt different from the false starts before. As the investigation deepened, ethical questions resurfaced with urgency. How much pressure was justified after so many years? How to balance the rights of individuals against the weight of unresolved harm? These debates played out behind closed doors, informed by legal counsel and moral reckoning, each decision calibrated to avoid tipping the case into irreversible error. The cold case demanded precision now, not just passion. Late nights stretched longer, the evidence room once again alive with quiet activity, detectives cross-referencing notes, revisiting photographs, rewatching footage until patterns emerged or dissolved. Fatigue was constant, but so was focus, sharpened by the awareness that the margin for mistake was shrinking. Every choice felt like it could accelerate the case toward resolution or send it back into years of dormancy. And beneath all of it, the silence persisted, but it had changed texture. It no longer felt empty. It felt crowded, dense with withheld truths, with memories pressing against the surface, waiting for the moment when they would no longer be protected by time or distance. The cold case was no longer merely unresolved. It was restless, stirring, as if the past itself had grown tired of waiting, as if something long hidden was beginning to realize that the space to remain hidden was running out. By the 9th phase, the investigation had crossed an invisible line, the point where uncertainty gives way to intent, where every step forward feels less like exploration and more like pursuit. The cold case carried a new weight now, the awareness that the truth was no longer abstract, no longer a distant possibility, but something with shape and gravity, something that could be approached, questioned, challenged. Detectives felt it in the tightening of protocols, in the careful choreography of interviews, in the way words were chosen and documented with an eye toward consequences rather than curiosity. Legal counsel became a constant presence, every move filtered through the lens of admissibility and risk. The years of patient accumulation had finally produced a framework sturdy enough to support confrontation, but fragile enough to collapse if mishandled. Investigators debated timing obsessively, knowing that acting too soon could scatter what little cooperation remained, while waiting too long might allow memories to calcify into rehearsed narratives once again. The case demanded balance, a controlled descent rather than a reckless plunge. One subject, long hovering at the edges of suspicion, now stood squarely in the center of internal discussions. His history intersected with the case at multiple points, none damning in isolation, but together forming a constellation that was increasingly difficult to ignore. Employment records placed him near locations of interest. Personal connections aligned uncomfortably well with the victim's routines. And most troubling of all, his statements over the years, when layered chronologically, revealed subtle shifts, small recalibrations that suggested adaptation rather than recollection. Investigators approached him again, this time with a strategy built not on accusation, but on inevitability. The interview room was unremarkable, deliberately so, designed to disarm rather than intimidate. Questions began broadly, revisiting familiar ground, allowing him to settle into the comfort of repetition. Then, gradually, the framing changed, details introduced out of sequence, minor facts presented as assumptions, watching closely for reactions. It was a method honed through years of practice, exploiting the human tendency to correct errors that threaten a carefully constructed story. The first crack appeared in a moment so small it could have been missed, a reflexive denial of a detail that hadn't actually been stated, an answer to a question that hadn't been asked. The room shifted subtly, posture changing, eyes narrowing, the air thickening with awareness. Investigators didn't pounce. They let the moment pass, noted it, and moved on, understanding that pressure applied too early can fortify defenses rather than dismantle them. Parallel to these efforts, forensic analysts delivered an update that sent a quiet jolt through the team. A partial profile extracted years earlier had finally found resonance in an expanded database, not a match, but a familial association, distant, incomplete, yet statistically significant. It was the kind of result that demands caution, easily misinterpreted, but impossible to ignore. When overlaid with existing suspicions, it strengthened a hypothesis that had once felt too bold to voice. The implications were staggering. A path emerged, narrow but navigable, leading from that night in 1998 through years of silence, through calculated normalcy, toward a present in which the past was beginning to knock insistently. Investigators coordinated quietly across jurisdictions, sharing information with a precision born of necessity, aware that leaks could derail everything. Surveillance, legal and discreet, was authorized, not to entrap, but to observe, to understand patterns that words alone could not reveal. Within the department, emotions ran high, excitement tempered by fear, the knowledge that even now, after all this time, the case could still slip away. Veterans warned against celebrating prematurely, reminding younger detectives of other cold cases that had reached this stage only to unravel under scrutiny. The mantra was discipline, patience, restraint. The community sensed the shift even without announcements. Longtime residents exchanged looks, old rumors resurfacing, speculation taking on a sharper edge. Some people withdrew, others leaned in, compelled by the possibility that the story they'd lived alongside for decades might finally change. The atmosphere grew taut, conversations cautious, the past pressing uncomfortably against the present. For the family, the ninth phase was almost unbearable. Hope, once guarded carefully, now demanded attention, intruding into daily life, disrupting routines, resurrecting emotions they'd learned to compartmentalize. Meetings with investigators carried more substance now, more specificity, though still no promises. They were told that the case was moving, that silence was giving way to sound, even if the words hadn't yet resolved into a clear answer. As the investigation advanced, ethical considerations intensified. The possibility of an arrest raised questions about closure versus truth, about whether answers after so long would heal or simply reopen wounds. Detectives wrestled with these questions privately, aware that their role was not to manage grief, but to pursue fact, even when fact complicates rather than resolves. And so the cold case edged closer to a moment it had been approaching for years, a moment when the accumulation of details, decisions, and patience would either coalesce into clarity or collapse under their own weight. The ninth phase ended not with a revelation, but with a collective inhale, a pause heavy with anticipation, the sense that the next step would be irreversible, that once taken, there would be no retreat into ambiguity, only the forward momentum of truth finally stepping out of the shadows, demanding to be confronted. The 10th phase arrived like the calm before impact, a deceptive stillness settling over the investigation as if the case itself were holding its breath. Every movement now was deliberate, documented, rehearsed, because the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. Detectives understood that whatever happened next would redefine the story permanently, either transforming decades of silence into accountability or reinforcing the cruel lesson that some truths resist exposure no matter how fiercely they are pursued. Preparation consumed everything. Statements were cross-checked against forensic timelines again and again, each inconsistency isolated, examined, weighed for significance. Analysts reconstructed behavioral arcs, not just of the central figure now under scrutiny, but of everyone orbiting him, mapping how information flowed, where it stalled, where it might have been intentionally diverted. The case had become less about a single night in 1998 and more about the architecture of concealment that followed, the quiet decisions that allowed the mystery to persist. Surveillance yielded insights that were subtle but unsettling. Patterns emerged in daily routines, deviations that aligned eerily well with moments when investigators applied pressure elsewhere. It suggested awareness, not panic, a controlled vigilance that hinted at long-practiced restraint. The subject didn't flee, didn't lash out, didn't confide recklessly. Instead, he adjusted, minimizing exposure, retreating into habits that blended seamlessly into normalcy, the very ordinariness that had protected him for years. A final interview was scheduled, framed officially as clarification, unofficially as confrontation. The room was chosen carefully, neutral, familiar, stripped of drama. When he arrived, there was no visible alarm, only a guarded politeness, the expression of someone accustomed to scrutiny. The conversation began where all the others had, with shared history, with reminders of time past, with the language of reflection rather than accusation. Detectives watched closely as the tone shifted, as questions narrowed, as context tightened around specific moments he'd referenced countless times before. Then came the pivot, the introduction of a detail he believed was safely buried, something never released publicly, something only those directly connected to the events could know. The reaction was immediate and unguarded, a flicker of recognition, followed by an effort to recover that arrived a second too late. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even an admission. But it was real, human, and undeniable, a fracture in the practiced composure that had defined every interaction until that point. The room fell into a heavy quiet, the kind that stretches seconds into something much longer. Detectives didn't press. They let the silence work, knowing that discomfort often speaks louder than interrogation. When the conversation resumed, his answers grew more careful, more abstract, circling rather than addressing, and with each deflection, the gap between his words and the evidence widened. By the time the interview ended, nothing definitive had been secured, yet everything had changed. Behind closed doors, the team assessed what they had, not in terms of certainty, but sufficiency. Legal thresholds were debated late into the night, arguments unfolding with surgical precision. Was the cumulative weight enough? Would it hold under cross-examination? Could they justify moving forward knowing how unforgiving the consequences would be if they were wrong? The cold case demanded an answer not just to what happened, but to how confident they were willing to be after all this time. External agencies were briefed quietly, contingency plans drafted, timelines synchronized. Even those steps carried emotional weight, the acknowledgement that the investigation was nearing a point of no return. For some detectives, it felt like vindication. For others, it felt like dread, the knowledge that resolution, if it came, would bring its own form of chaos, reopening wounds, challenging memories, forcing a community to confront a past it had learned to live alongside. News of heightened activity leaked despite precautions, fueling speculation that spread quickly, sharpening the town's collective anxiety. Conversations grew hushed again, eyes lingered longer, and the old unease returned, thicker now because it carried expectation. People sensed that something was coming, though no one could say exactly what, and that uncertainty proved almost as oppressive as the original disappearance. For the family, the waiting became almost unbearable. They were told only that the case had reached a critical juncture, that decisions were being weighed carefully, that patience was still required. Patience, after all these years, felt like both a cruel demand and a familiar one. They clung to routine, to normalcy, even as the possibility of answers pressed in from all sides, threatening to upend everything they'd built to survive. As the 10th phase drew to its close, the cold case stood on the edge of transformation. Evidence had converged. Silence had fractured. The past, long contained, was beginning to assert itself with urgency. Whether that urgency would crystallize into justice or dissolve into another chapter of unanswered questions remained uncertain, but one thing was clear now: the story could no longer remain suspended. The next step would force the truth, whatever shape it took, into the open, and once that happened, there would be no returning to the quiet, no undoing the momentum that had been gathering for more than 2 decades, waiting for this exact moment to finally arrive. The 11th phase began with action that could no longer be disguised as routine. What had been preparation now became movement, coordinated and irreversible. Warrants were finalized, signatures inked with a gravity that weighed on everyone in the room. Years of restraint gave way to a narrow window where timing mattered as much as truth. One misstep could collapse the case. One hesitation could let it slip away again. Before dawn, teams assembled in silence. Radios were checked, vehicles staged, routes memorized.
No siren, no spectacle.
This was not about drama, it was about control. The subject of the investigation was approached the way investigators approach all long-buried truths, carefully, deliberately, with the understanding that history has a way of resisting correction. When the knock finally came, it was firm, measured, unmistakable. Inside, the search unfolded with methodical precision. Drawers opened, boxes lifted, old documents resurfaced, yellowed and brittle, carrying the quiet weight of years untouched. Digital devices were cataloged, sealed, removed. Nothing was rushed. Every item was treated as if it might be the one detail capable of tipping the balance. And then, in a place no one expected to matter anymore, something appeared that made the room still. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't overtly incriminating at first glance. But it matched a gap investigators had struggled with for decades, a missing link between timeline and opportunity. The kind of artifact that doesn't shout, but whispers with terrifying clarity once you know how to listen. The lead investigator recognized it immediately, the way one recognizes a face long imagined but never seen. By midday, the tone had shifted. Calls were made to forensic specialists, to prosecutors, to analysts who had lived with the case in fragments and theories. Now, there was something solid to place in their hands. Something that demanded reevaluation of assumptions once considered settled. The cold case was no longer abstract. It had texture again, substance, gravity. The subject was brought in, this time not for conversation, but for procedure. The atmosphere was different. No small talk, no easing into memory. Rights were read. Silence followed. He listened, expression unreadable, but the confidence that once defined him had thinned. Investigators didn't push. They didn't need to. The evidence now spoke loudly enough on its own. As word spread within the department, reactions were mixed. Some felt the surge of vindication, the rare satisfaction of seeing persistence rewarded. Others felt only heaviness, the awareness that resolution often carries collateral damage. A case solved does not simply end. It reverberates through families, through reputations, through an entire community forced to revise its understanding of the past. By evening, confirmation arrived. The new evidence aligned. Forensics supported it. Timelines tightened. Doubt, while never fully erased, retreated into the margins. Prosecutors agreed. The threshold had been crossed. The decision to move forward was no longer hypothetical. It was happening. Outside, the town sensed the shift. Unmarked cars lingered longer. Familiar streets felt unfamiliar again. Rumors hardened into expectation. For a community that had grown accustomed to the cold case as an unsolved backdrop, the idea of answers felt almost intrusive, as if clarity itself might disrupt a fragile equilibrium. For the family, the call came late. Few details were shared, only that significant progress had been made, that the investigation was entering its final stages. Relief and fear collided instantly. Hope, after so many years, felt dangerous. They had learned what unanswered questions could do. Now they were about to learn what answers might cost. As the 11th phase closed, the case crossed an invisible line. It was no longer a matter of if the past would resurface, but how. The machinery of justice had begun to turn in earnest, slow but unstoppable. And somewhere beneath the layers of procedure and proof, the truth, long patient, long hidden, was finally being escorted out of the dark, step by deliberate step, toward a reckoning that could no longer be delayed. By the time the 12th phase unfolded, the machinery was no longer quiet. It moved with a low, grinding momentum that could be felt in every hallway, every briefing room, every late-night phone call. The case, once whispered about as an unsolvable cold case, had become a living presence again, demanding attention, demanding precision, demanding that nothing be left to chance. Paperwork multiplied. Timelines were reconstructed yet again, this time not as speculation, but as accusation. Interviews resumed under a harsher light. Old witnesses were contacted, some reluctantly, others with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Voices that had once trembled with uncertainty now carried a different tone, measured, careful, aware that words spoken decades earlier were being weighed again, not as memories, but as potential evidence. Some stories aligned more cleanly than before. Others cracked under scrutiny, revealing inconsistencies that had gone unnoticed when the case was young and time seemed abundant. The suspect sat through hours of questioning without spectacle. No confession, no dramatic collapse, just silence, punctuated by brief, calculated responses. He knew the weight had shifted. He knew the room no longer needed him to speak in order to move forward. Investigators watched closely, not for emotion but for control slipping, for the subtle signs that pressure was doing what time alone never could. Forensic labs worked around the clock. Samples once considered marginal were retested, re-examined with technologies that did not exist when the case first went cold. Data points converged. Probability narrowed. The margin for coincidence shrank until it was almost gone. Each report that came back added another layer, another quiet confirmation that the story investigators had been circling for years was finally solidifying into something unavoidably real. Outside the system, the community braced itself. News traveled faster now, stripped of detail but heavy with implication. A name began to circulate, not officially, not yet, but enough to unsettle routines, to turn familiar faces into subjects of quiet speculation. People revisited old conversations, old assumptions, old moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The past was no longer distant. It was pressing in from all sides. The family waited, suspended in a state that was neither relief nor grief, but something more exhausting than both. Closure had been promised too many times before, always retreating just out of reach. Now, with the case advancing in ways that could not be undone, they felt the weight of anticipation settle deep. Answers were coming. Whether they would heal or harm was still an open question. Prosecutors met behind closed doors, mapping strategy, anticipating defenses, preparing for a fight that would be as much about narrative as evidence. They understood the risks. A case built over decades carries history, and history can be used against itself. Every decision was measured, every move deliberate. This was not just about proving guilt. It was about proving certainty. As night fell, the case file, once thin, then bloated with unanswered questions, now read differently. It had direction. It had intent. It had an ending forming at its edges, though no one dared speak it aloud. The cold case had crossed into a final, volatile stage, where truth and consequence moved closer together with each passing hour. And still, beneath the layers of legal process and institutional resolve, one truth remained unchanged. Nothing that happened next would erase the years lost, the damage done, or the silence that had stretched for so long. The 12th phase was not about celebration. It was about reckoning, about facing the cost of knowing what had once been hidden, and accepting that even when justice moves forward, it never arrives without leaving scars behind. The 13th phase arrived without ceremony, but it carried a finality that everyone involved could feel. This was no longer an investigation searching for shape. It was a case preparing to speak its last, irreversible sentences. Files were locked. Evidence was logged for the final time. Chains of custody were reviewed with almost obsessive care, as if repetition itself could ward off the ghosts of past mistakes. Nothing could be allowed to fracture now. Not after everything. The suspect was formally charged, the words delivered in a tone deliberately stripped of drama. Yet the impact was seismic. A name, once spoken casually in grocery stores and school hallways, was now inseparable from a crime that had haunted the region for a generation. Cameras gathered outside buildings that had never drawn attention before. Reporters searched for angles, for emotion, for something that could translate decades of quiet obsession into a headline sharp enough to cut through the noise. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was dense, heavy with expectation. This was not the explosive chaos people imagine from television. It was slower, colder. A procedural march where every step mattered. Prosecutors laid out timelines that now fit with terrifying precision. Defense attorneys pushed back, questioning memory, motive, the reliability of science applied to old wounds. The clash was not loud, but relentless. The family listened, absorbing each detail as if it were both a revelation and a reopening. There were moments when the past surged forward with brutal clarity, photographs, descriptions, fragments of testimony that dragged long-buried grief back into the light. Yet there was also something new in the room. Not peace. Not yet. But a sense that the story, for the first time, was no longer slipping away from them. Outside, the community fractured along invisible lines. Some expressed disbelief, clinging to the version of history they had lived with for years. Others felt a grim validation, as though an unspoken suspicion had finally been granted form. Conversations grew cautious. Trust recalibrated itself in real time. The case was no longer an abstract cold case discussed in hindsight. It was a present-tense reckoning. As proceedings advanced, the weight of the years became impossible to ignore. Witnesses aged by time and memory took the stand, their voices carrying both certainty and erosion. Experts spoke of probabilities, of margins, of near impossibilities that, when combined, pointed in one direction only. The narrative tightened. Resistance weakened. What had once been a mystery now stood exposed, stripped of romance, stripped of speculation. When the verdict was read, it landed without flourish. No gasp, no outburst, just a collective stillness, as if the room itself needed a moment to accept that the long wait was over. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely looks the way people imagine. It does not restore what was lost. It does not rewind time. It simply acknowledges reality and demands accountability. In the days that followed, the case receded from the headlines, replaced by newer crises, newer shocks. But for those who had lived inside it, nothing truly ended. The cold case, once an open wound, had closed, but scars remained, tracing the outline of years spent in uncertainty, suspicion, and silence. The 13th phase did not offer a triumphant conclusion. It offered something quieter, heavier, more enduring. The truth, finally spoken aloud. The knowledge that some answers arrive late, incomplete, and costly, but that even then, they matter. Because the past, no matter how deeply buried, always waits. And eventually it demands to be heard. The 14th phase did not begin with noise or movement. It began with aftermath. With the quiet that settles in once the machinery slows, once decisions are rendered, and there is nothing left to argue. The courtroom emptied. The microphones were turned off. What remained was a strange vacuum, where decades of pursuit abruptly lost their forward momentum and left everyone standing still, unsure of how to exist without the weight that had driven them for so long. Inside the department, desks were cleared of binders that had grown thick with age. Evidence boxes were sealed and moved into long-term storage, their labels now definitive instead of tentative. Detectives who had inherited the case late in their careers felt something close to disbelief. For years, the cold case had been a constant, an unsolved presence that lingered in conversations, training sessions, late-night debates. Now it was history, no longer open, no longer asking questions. But closure, as it turned out, was not a single moment. It fractured into many smaller ones. A retired investigator sat alone at home, replaying old decisions, wondering what might have happened if technology had arrived sooner, if one interview had gone differently. A forensic analyst reviewed notes from years past, realizing how close they had been without knowing it. The case had not just ended. It had echoed backward, reshaping memories of the work itself. The family faced a different reckoning. The verdict had answered the central question, but it had also removed the structure that waiting had provided. For years, hope, however fragile, had been organized around the idea of resolution. Now that it had arrived, it left behind a silence that felt unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Grief resurfaced in new forms, no longer tied to uncertainty, but to permanence. The truth was known, and knowing changed nothing about what had been taken. Public interest waned quickly. Headlines gave way to footnotes. The case became an example, a reference point in discussions about cold cases and modern forensics. To the outside world, it was a success story. Proof that persistence worked. Proof that time did not always defeat justice. But within the community, the narrative was less clean. Trust had been damaged. Assumptions had been shattered. Familiar faces now carried a different weight. Conversations grew reflective rather than reactive. People spoke about the year it happened, about where they had been, what they remembered feeling when the news first broke. Some admitted they had suspected. Others insisted they never could have imagined it. The truth, once revealed, had a way of rewriting personal histories, inserting itself into moments that had once felt ordinary. The convicted man disappeared into the system, processed, transported, absorbed by an institution designed to remove individuals from public life. There was no dramatic farewell, no final statement that offered clarity or remorse. Just paperwork, procedure, and a quiet bend pulling away. For many, that absence was unsettling. The figure who had loomed so large in theory now existed only as a file number and a location on a map. As weeks passed, the cold case took on a new identity. It was no longer an open question, but it wasn't simply resolved either. It became a reminder of how long truth can hide, of how easily it can blend into routine, of how communities can carry unanswered questions without realizing the toll they take. The 14th phase was not about justice being served. That had already happened. It was about absorption, about allowing reality to settle into the spaces once occupied by speculation and doubt, about understanding that endings do not arrive with certainty, but with adjustment. And beneath it all, a quieter realization emerged, one that no verdict could erase. That even when a cold case is finally solved, it does not restore the past. It only clarifies it, leaving those who remain to live with a version of history that is sharper, heavier, and impossible to ignore. The 15th phase unfolded long after the public had stopped paying attention, when the case existed only in records, memories, and the quiet spaces it had hollowed out. Time moved on the way it always does, indifferently, relentlessly, but the imprint of what had been uncovered refused to fade. This was the phase no one plans for, the one that arrives after justice has spoken and left people alone with its consequences. In the town, routines slowly reassembled themselves. Shops opened and closed. Children who hadn't been born when the crime occurred now walked the same streets, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Yet for those who remembered, the environment felt altered. Certain corners carried a different weight. Certain dates passed with an unspoken heaviness. The solved cold case had not disappeared. It had settled into the background, shaping perception in subtle, permanent ways. Investigators returned to other work, other files, other names. But the case lingered with them, surfacing in moments of hesitation, in renewed caution during interviews, in a sharper awareness of how easily assumptions can harden into blind spots. The years spent chasing one truth had changed how they approached all others. Persistence was no longer an abstract value. It was personal, earned, etched into their professional identities. The family learned to live with answers that arrived too late to heal cleanly. There were no dramatic transformations, no sudden peace. Instead, there was adjustment, slow, uneven, deeply human. They spoke the victim's name more freely now, no longer tethered to speculation or fear of being wrong. Memory shifted from investigation to remembrance, from uncertainty to mourning. It was not easier, but it was different. Occasionally, the case resurfaced in documentaries, articles, late-night discussions about cold cases and breakthroughs. Each retelling simplified what had been complex, compressed what had taken decades into neat arcs and conclusions. Those who had lived it felt the distance between story and reality acutely. They knew how much had been lost in translation, the waiting, the doubt, the false starts, the long stretches where nothing happened at all. The truth, once uncovered, proved impossible to contain. It influenced policy discussions, funding decisions, the way old evidence was treated elsewhere. Other cold cases were reopened, examined with fresh urgency. In that sense, the case refused to remain singular. Its resolution echoed outward, quietly reshaping the future of investigations far beyond its original boundaries. And yet, for all its impact, something unresolved remained. Not legally, not factually, but emotionally. There were questions no verdict addressed, motives never fully explained, silences that stayed intact even after guilt was established. The past had been clarified, but it had not been made whole. As years passed, the cold case became part of the town's inherited knowledge, a story passed down not as rumor anymore, but as caution. A reminder that evil does not always announce itself. That time can obscure truth without erasing it. That answers, when they finally come, demand as much from the living as the questions ever did. The 15th phase did not close the narrative. It widened it. It acknowledged that resolution is not an ending, but a transition from not knowing to knowing, from searching to living with what has been found. The case no longer asked to be solved. It asked to be remembered, understood, and carried forward with honesty. Because some stories do not conclude with silence or applause. They conclude with awareness, with a quiet understanding that the past is never truly behind us. It waits, patient and exacting, until someone is willing to look at it long enough to see it clearly.